The crash of splintering wood echoed through the mountain cabin as Jake Morrison's fist connected with the kitchen table for the third time this week. Coffee splattered across unpaid bills and foreclosure notices, the dark liquid seeping into papers that already bore the stains of previous outbursts. His knuckles throbbed, adding to the collection of scars that mapped his hands like a testament to 5 years of barely controlled rage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Outside, the October wind howled through the towering pines of Whispering Pine Ridge, rattling the windows of the cabin that had once been his sanctuary and was now his prison. The sound used to comfort him, back when he believed the mountains could heal what the corporate world had broken. Now it only reminded him of how isolated he'd become, how completely he'd severed every connection to the life he'd once known. Jake stared at the foreclosure notice, the words blurring together as exhaustion weighed down his eyelids. Morrison Timber Company, the business his grandfather had built from nothing, reduced to a line item in a bankruptcy filing. 3 generations of honest work destroyed by one man's greed and Jake's own naive trust. He could still see Marcus Whitfield's face, his former business partner's smile as he'd signed the papers that would transfer the company's assets to shell corporations, leaving Jake with nothing but debt and the bitter taste of betrayal. The cabin creaked around him, settling into the familiar groans and sighs of old wood facing another mountain winter. Empty beer bottles lined the counter, evidence of his attempts to numb the memories that played on endless repeat in his mind. The day he'd discovered the fraudulent contracts, the moment he'd realized that every handshake deal, every gentleman's agreement, every ounce of trust he'd placed in his partner had been weaponized against him. The look in his employees' eyes, when he'd had to tell them there would be no final paychecks, no severance, nothing but apologies that felt as hollow as his bank account. The morning sun struggled through the grimy windows of Jake Morrison's mountain cabin, casting weak light across a scene that would have horrified the man he used to be. Dishes sat moldering in the sink, their surfaces growing things that belonged in a biology textbook rather than a kitchen. Empty takeout containers from his monthly trips to town created small monuments to his complete abandonment of basic human maintenance. The hardwood floors that his grandfather had installed with such pride were now scarred and dull, hidden beneath layers of neglect and the occasional bootprint from Jake's rare ventures outside. 5 years ago, Jake Morrison had been the kind of man who wore custom suits and made decisions that affected hundreds of employees. He'd driven a Tesla, lived in a penthouse overlooking Charlotte's skyline, and possessed the kind of confidence that came from building something meaningful with his own hands. Morrison Timber Company hadn't just been a business to him. It had been a legacy, a bridge between his grandfather's rough-hewn determination and his own modern business acumen. The company had supplied sustainable lumber to construction projects across 3 states, employing half the men in Cedar Falls and providing health care for their families. But that man might as well have been a character in a movie for all the connection Jake felt to him now. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone, each revelation about Marcus Whitfield's betrayal taking another piece of who Jake thought he was. First came the discovery that contracts had been altered, then the revelation that environmental permits had been falsified, and finally the crushing realization that the business loans he'd co-signed had been used to fund Whitfield's personal ventures rather than company operations. The legal battles had drained what little resources Jake had managed to salvage. Lawyers who'd initially been confident about recovering the stolen assets gradually became evasive, then apologetic, then simply stopped returning his calls. Whitfield had covered his tracks well, and by the time Jake understood the scope of the deception, his former partner was living in the Cayman Islands, safely beyond the reach of both creditors and criminal prosecutors. Jake pushed himself up from the kitchen table, his back protesting the night spent sleeping in a wooden chair. At 38, his body already felt decades older, worn down by poor nutrition, too much alcohol, and the kind of stress that ate away at a man from the inside. His reflection in the microwave door showed a stranger with hollow cheeks and eyes that had forgotten how to focus on anything beyond the next meal, the next bill, the next small humiliation that poverty provided with reliable regularity. The refrigerator held the usual suspects of bachelor desperation: expired milk, leftover pizza that had achieved the consistency of cardboard, and 3 cans of beer that represented his entire plan for the day. He'd stopped buying real groceries months ago, when he'd finally accepted that cooking required a level of hope about the future that he simply couldn't muster. Why plan a meal, when you weren't sure you'd still have a roof over your head next week. His phone buzzed against the counter, the sound sharp and intrusive in the cabin's heavy silence. Jake stared at it without moving, experience having taught him that calls these days brought only bad news. Bill collectors who somehow remained relentlessly cheerful while describing the various ways they intended to destroy what remained of his credit. Government agencies with acronyms he'd never heard of, all seemingly devoted to ensuring that his financial resurrection remained as unlikely as possible. But the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, which in his current situation represented a small mercy. Unknown callers might be selling something he couldn't afford, but at least they weren't calling to take away something he still had. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice coming out rougher than he'd expected. Apparently, yesterday had been one of those days when he'd forgotten to speak aloud entirely. The voice that responded was female, professionally friendly but with an undertone of wariness that suggested she'd made her share of difficult phone calls. She introduced herself as Emma Walsh from Sparkle Clean Services, calling about the online inquiry he'd submitted for house cleaning services. Jake frowned, trying to remember when he might have done such a thing. His internet usage these days was limited to job searches that led nowhere and social media masochism that involved looking up his former employees to see how they'd managed to rebuild their lives. The idea that he'd voluntarily sought out a cleaning service seemed as foreign as the idea that he'd signed up for ballet lessons. Then the memory surfaced, hazy and embarrassing. 3 weeks ago, during one of his periodic attempts to pull himself together, he'd spent an entire day creating action plans and making lists. He'd applied for 17 jobs, updated his LinkedIn profile, and in a moment of what could only be described as delusional optimism, decided that having a clean house might somehow help him feel like a functional human being again. The woman continued talking, explaining their services with the kind of practiced enthusiasm that's preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Suggested she'd given this speech many times before. Deep cleaning, organization, maintenance schedules, all delivered with affordable rates and flexible payment plans. She mentioned that they specialized in helping people who were going through difficult transitions, a phrase that made Jake wonder how obvious his desperation had been in whatever inquiry he'd submitted. He found himself agreeing to an estimate, partly because her voice carried a warmth that he hadn't heard directed at him in months, and partly because some stubborn part of his psyche still believed that external changes might somehow catalyze internal ones. They scheduled the appointment for the following afternoon, giving Jake 24 hours to decide whether he wanted a stranger to witness the full extent of his deterioration. After hanging up, Jake spent several minutes staring at the phone, trying to remember what hope felt like. The last time someone had voluntarily entered his space had been 6 months ago, when his sister had driven up from Atlanta with the stated intention of staging an intervention. The visit had lasted exactly 43 minutes before she'd fled, leaving behind a lecture about self-respect and a $20 bill that he'd spent on beer. The rest of the day passed in the formless way that had become standard for Jake's existence. He moved from room to room without purpose, occasionally picking up objects and setting them down elsewhere without accomplishing anything that could be described as cleaning or organizing. The cabin seemed to resist his half-hearted efforts, as if 5 years of neglect had given it a momentum of its own that wouldn't be easily reversed. By evening, Jake had managed to clear a narrow path through the living room and gather the most obviously moldy food items from the kitchen. It wasn't progress so much as damage control, an attempt to ensure that tomorrow's visitor wouldn't immediately flee or call social services. He'd known men who'd let their lives deteriorate to the point where intervention became necessary. And while Jake had lost most of his pride, he still retained enough to want to avoid that particular humiliation. The night brought the usual parade of regrets and what-if scenarios that had become his primary form of entertainment. What if he'd been more careful about the contracts? What if he'd questioned Whitfield's explanations instead of trusting a friendship that had apparently been one-sided from the beginning? What if he'd kept closer control of the company finances instead of delegating that responsibility to someone whose loyalty had been for sale? The questions never led anywhere productive, but they filled the hours between dinner and the exhaustion that eventually dragged him into sleep. Dreams, when they came, were filled with spreadsheets and courtrooms, with the faces of employees he'd failed, and the echo of his grandfather's voice asking how 3 generations of honest work had come to such an inglorious end. Jake woke the next morning with the familiar sensation that he'd been running all night. his heart still racing from chases and confrontations that existed only in his subconscious. The October air had turned sharper overnight, carrying the promise of winter and the reminder that heating bills would soon be added to his collection of financial impossibilities. He spent the morning in a flurry of activity that felt foreign after months of purposeless drift. Laundry went into machines that protested their sudden return to service. Dishes were scraped and soaked in water hot enough to kill whatever organisms had taken up residence in the aftermath of his neglect. The effort left him sweating and slightly dizzy, his body unused to sustain physical activity that didn't involve lifting beer cans or searching through cabinets for food that hadn't yet achieved sentience. By noon, the cabin looked marginally less like a crime scene and more like the home of someone who'd simply lost a battle with depression. It wasn't good, but it was better, and for Jake that represented the kind of victory he'd learned to celebrate in small increments. The woman from Sparkle Clean Services was due to arrive at 2 o'clock, which gave Jake time to shower and locate clothes that didn't smell like they'd been marinating in despair. The shower revealed how thin he'd become, his ribs visible beneath skin that had lost the healthy color of someone who spent time outdoors. The man in the mirror looked like a refugee from his own life, and Jake found himself wondering what kind of person would voluntarily enter such obvious wreckage. At exactly 2 o'clock, the sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of his appointment. Jake watched through the living room window as a small, reliable-looking sedan made its way up the winding drive that led to his cabin. The car was clean but not new, the kind of vehicle that suggested practical priorities and careful budgeting. A magnetic sign on the door displayed the Sparkle Clean Services logo in cheerful blue letters, complete with a cartoon sparkle that seemed aggressively optimistic given the task ahead. The driver's door opened, and Jake got his first look at Emma Walsh. She was younger than he'd expected, probably early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that managed to look both professional and prepared for serious work. Even from a distance, she moved with the kind of purposeful energy that Jake dimly remembered possessing, back when he'd believed that effort could solve problems and that tomorrow might actually be better than today. But it was the passenger who captured Jake's attention and made his breath catch in his throat. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, climbed out of the car with the careful movements of a child who'd learned to be cautious about new situations. She had her mother's auburn hair and large eyes that seemed to take in everything with the kind of intense observation that suggested unusual intelligence or unusual wariness. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. It had been years since he'd been around children, and longer still since he'd felt any connection to innocence or hope. But watching the little girl scan his property with serious attention, he experienced a flutter of something that might have been protectiveness, or might have been the ghost of the man he used to be trying to remember what it felt like to care about someone other than himself. The knock on his door came exactly 3 minutes later, measured and professional. Jake opened it to find Emma Walsh standing on his porch with a warm smile that didn't quite hide the quick assessment she was making of both him and his living situation. Up close, she was even prettier than she'd appeared from the window, but it was a practical kind of beauty. The attractiveness of someone who didn't have time for vanity but couldn't help being naturally appealing. Behind her, the little girl waited with the patience of someone much older, her small hands clasped in front of her as she studied Jake with frank curiosity. There was something about her gaze that reminded him of his sister's children, the way kids could look right through adult pretenses and see the truth underneath. Emma introduced herself and her daughter Lily, explaining that school had ended early due to a teacher workday and apologizing for having to bring her along. Her voice carried the same warmth he'd heard over the phone, but in person Jake could detect the underlying tension of someone who was working hard to maintain professional composure while dealing with personal challenges. Jake invited them inside, acutely aware of how the cabin must look to fresh eyes despite his morning's efforts. Emma's expression remained carefully neutral as she took in the obvious signs of long-term neglect. But Jake caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she'd seen similar situations before. Lily, on the other hand, seemed fascinated rather than appalled, her gaze moving from the water-stained ceiling to the pile of newspapers that Jake had meant to throw away but somehow never had. The estimate process took longer than Jake had expected. partly because Emma was thorough in her assessment, and partly because Lily kept asking questions about everything from the age of the cabin to the identity of various animals whose tracks were visible in the muddy areas around the foundation. Her curiosity was infectious, and Jake found himself answering her questions with more enthusiasm than he'd felt about anything in months. Emma worked her way through each room with professional efficiency, making notes on a tablet and occasionally taking pictures of areas that would require special attention. She asked practical questions about his priorities and budget constraints with the kind of directness that Jake appreciated. No judgment, no false sympathy, just the straightforward discussion of problems and solutions. When they reached the kitchen, Lily announced that she was hungry, and Emma's carefully maintained composure slipped for just a moment. Jake caught the flash of worry that crossed her face, the quick calculation of someone who was probably counting every dollar and wondering if stopping for a snack would throw off a carefully planned budget. Without really thinking about it, Jake offered to make sandwiches, then immediately regretted the impulse when he remembered the sorry state of his refrigerator. But Lily's face lit up with such obvious pleasure at the suggestion that he found himself committed to the idea, regardless of the limited ingredients available. The sandwich-making process revealed more about his visitors than the formal estimate had. Emma insisted on helping, moving around his kitchen with the easy competence of someone who'd spent years making meals work regardless of circumstances. Lily chattered about school and friends, and a hamster named Mr. Whiskers who apparently had strong opinions about proper cage maintenance. As they worked together in the small space, Jake began to notice details that his isolation-fogged brain had initially missed. Emma's clothes were clean and well-maintained, but showed signs of careful mending in places. Her shoes were practical rather than fashionable, chosen for durability rather than style. Most telling of all was the way she automatically portioned the food, taking the smallest serving for herself and making sure Lily got the largest share. The unconscious behavior of someone who'd grown accustomed to making sacrifices. The meal was simple, peanut butter and jelly on bread that was only slightly stale, but it felt like the most civilized interaction Jake had experienced in months. Lily kept up a steady stream of conversation, moving seamlessly from observations about the cabin to questions about mountain wildlife, to detailed explanations of her favorite books. Emma listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested she genuinely enjoyed her daughter's company, occasionally adding her own comments or gently redirecting the conversation when it veered toward topics that made her visibly uncomfortable. It was during one of these conversational detours that Jake learned they'd recently moved to Cedar Falls from somewhere Emma referred to only as down south. The way she said it, with a slight tightening of her voice and a quick glance at Lily, suggested that the move hadn't been entirely voluntary. Jake recognized the evasiveness of someone trying to leave difficult circumstances behind, the careful editing of personal history that came with starting over. When the estimate was complete, Emma quoted a price that was significantly lower than Jake had expected, low enough that he found himself wondering if she was deliberately undercharging out of sympathy for his obvious circumstances. The thought bothered him more than it should have, pride rearing its head despite years of systematic humiliation. But when he asked about the pricing, Emma explained matter-of-factly that she was building a client base in the area and preferred to establish long-term relationships rather than maximize short-term profits. She offered flexible payment arrangements and suggested they could start with the most urgent areas and tackle the rest over time as his budget allowed. The practical kindness of the arrangement, delivered without condescension or pity, nearly undid Jake's carefully maintained composure. He'd grown so accustomed to being treated as a cautionary tale or an object of charity that genuine professional respect felt like a gift he didn't deserve. They scheduled the first cleaning session for the following week, Emma explaining that she'd need a few days to acquire some specialized supplies for what she diplomatically termed the initial restoration phase. As they prepared to leave, Lily surprised Jake by asking if she could see his workshop, having noticed the small outbuilding where he'd once maintained his woodworking equipment. The workshop had been Jake's retreat during the good years, the place where he'd gone to remember why he'd fallen in love with timber in the first place. Now it stood as a monument to abandoned hobbies and discarded dreams, filled with tools that hadn't been touched in years and projects that would never be completed. But Lily's enthusiasm was infectious, and Jake found himself unlocking the door and showing her around despite his embarrassment at the space's neglected condition. She was fascinated by everything, from the massive table saw to the hand tools that had belonged to his grandfather. Her questions were surprisingly sophisticated for someone her age, suggesting either natural mechanical aptitude or exposure to similar environments. Emma followed them into the workshop, and Jake watched her expression change as she took in the quality of the equipment and the evidence of genuine craftsmanship in the half-finished projects that littered the space. For the first time since they'd arrived, she seemed to see past his current circumstances to the person he used to be. As they finally prepared to leave, Lily turned back to Jake with the kind of serious expression that children sometimes wore when they were about to say something important. She told him that his house felt sad, but not mean, and that she thought it would be happy again once her mom cleaned it up. The simple observation, delivered with a child's absolute certainty, hit Jake harder than any of the well-meaning advice he'd received from family members or former friends. After they drove away, Jake stood in his doorway, watching their taillights disappear down the mountain road. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to something, anticipating a future event with something approaching enthusiasm rather than dread. The cabin felt different somehow, as if the brief presence of other people had shifted its fundamental energy. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed expectant, pregnant with possibilities that Jake couldn't quite name but was beginning to believe might actually exist. That night, for the first time in months, Jake fell asleep without the assistance of alcohol, his dreams filled not with spreadsheets and courtrooms, but with the sound of a little girl's laughter and the memory of working alongside someone who saw solutions where he had only seen problems. The week that followed passed with an anticipation that Jake barely recognized as his own emotion. He found himself making small improvements to the cabin, not out of shame about Emma's impending return, but from a slowly awakening desire to be worthy of the effort she was planning to invest in his space. Part 2. Daily routine reveals character depth. The alarm clock's harsh buzz shattered the mountain silence at 5:30 in the morning, though Jake Morrison had been awake for the better part of an hour, staring at the water-stained ceiling, while his mind churned through the same endless cycle of regrets and recriminations that had become his dawn ritual. The sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the cabin's oppressive quiet, each exhale a reminder of another day he'd have to navigate without purpose or direction. Jake rolled out of bed, with the mechanical movements of someone going through motions rather than living them. His bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor, sending a shock through his system that might have been invigorating once, but now just felt like another small punishment in an endless series of daily penances. The floorboards creaked under his weight, their protests echoing through rooms that had grown accustomed to solitude and neglect. The bathroom mirror reflected a man who looked like he'd been carved from driftwood, all sharp angles and weathered surfaces. His beard had grown wild and unkempt, more hermit than lumberjack, while his hair stuck up in directions that defied both gravity and common sense. The eyes that stared back at him held the hollow quality of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to look forward to anything beyond the next meal or the next drink. His morning routine had been stripped down to the bare essentials of survival. A splash of cold water on his face because the hot water heater had given up the ghost 3 months ago, and he couldn't afford to have it repaired. Teeth brushed with a toothbrush, whose bristles had long since surrendered to overuse, and a tube of toothpaste squeezed so thoroughly that it resembled modern art more than personal hygiene supplies. The kitchen awaited him, with its familiar tableau of defeat. Dirty dishes created abstract sculptures in the sink, while the countertops bore the archaeological layers of someone who'd given up on basic maintenance. The coffee maker, a relic from his previous life when he'd owned things that worked properly, wheezed and gurgled its way through the process of creating something that resembled coffee, if you squinted and didn't breathe through your nose. Jake's breakfast consisted of instant oatmeal mixed with water because the milk in his refrigerator had achieved a consistency that belonged in a science experiment rather than on cereal. He ate standing at the counter, staring out the window at the forest that surrounded his property like a green wall between him and the world he'd once inhabited. The trees were beginning their autumn transformation, their leaves shifting from green to gold and crimson in a display of natural beauty that felt like a mockery of his own seasonal descent into another winter of isolation. The newspaper, when it arrived, brought its daily dose of reality in the form of economic reports that reminded him how far he'd fallen, and job listings that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the relevance they held to his current skill set. Former CEO of a timber company wasn't exactly a transferable qualification in a job market that had moved on without him. His attempts at networking had devolved into exercises in humiliation, conversations with former colleagues who spoke to him with the careful pity reserved for casualties of their shared industry. After breakfast, Jake would typically embark on what he generously called his daily walk, though it was really more of a desperate attempt to escape the cabin's suffocating atmosphere. The mountain trails that had once been his refuge now felt like prison corridors, familiar paths that led nowhere, and offered no relief from the thoughts that followed him like persistent shadows. He'd encounter the occasional hiker or morning jogger, their bright outdoor gear and healthy complexions serving as stark reminders of the life he'd abandoned along with everything else. The forest itself seemed to judge his presence, the silence between bird calls feeling pregnant with disapproval. Squirrels would pause in their acorn gathering to stare at him with what Jake was certain was woodland contempt, while deer would bolt at his approach, as if sensing the aura of failure that surrounded him like cologne made from disappointment. Even the trees, those magnificent pines and oaks that had once represented his livelihood and passion, now stood as monuments to everything he'd lost. Returning to the cabin after these walks felt like surrendering to gravity, an inevitable descent back into the space that had become both sanctuary and prison. The silence would settle around him like a heavy blanket, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant sound of wind through the forest canopy. He tried listening to music, but every song seemed to carry memories of better times, while talk radio only reminded him of the world continuing to function without his participation. Lunch was typically a negotiation between his remaining supplies and his complete lack of motivation to create anything resembling actual food. Peanut butter sandwiches had become a staple, along with whatever canned goods he could afford during his monthly expeditions to town. The trips to Cedar Falls had become exercises in strategic shopping, calculating the maximum nutritional value per dollar while avoiding the eyes of former employees who might recognize him and feel obligated to make small talk about his current circumstances. The afternoons stretched before him like desert highways, empty and shimmering with heat mirages of productivity that never materialized. He'd attempt to tackle projects around the cabin, but his efforts usually devolved into half-hearted gestures that left things worse than he'd found them. The gutters that needed cleaning remained clogged with autumn leaves, while the loose boards on the porch continued to protest under foot traffic with increasingly vocal complaints. His workshop, that cathedral of craftsmanship where he'd once created furniture and decorative pieces that had earned respect throughout the region, had become a museum of abandoned intentions. Tools that had once been extensions of his hands now gathered dust like relics from a civilization that no longer existed. The table saw stood silent and accusatory, its blade gathering rust while projects in various stages of completion served as monuments to the optimism he'd once possessed. The computer, when he could bring himself to open it, offered a window into a world that had moved on without him. Social media feeds filled with the success stories of former colleagues, their promotions and achievements feeling like personal indictments of his own failure to adapt and overcome. Job search websites had become his version of gambling, each application submitted with the desperate hope that this might be the one that would restore meaning to his existence, only to be met with automated rejection emails or the even more crushing response of complete silence. Evening brought its own rituals of defeat. Dinner was usually whatever required the least preparation and cleanup, eaten while standing in the kitchen because sitting at the table made the meal feel too much like an occasion worth acknowledging. The television, when it worked, offered escape into other people's problems, though even fictional drama seemed to have more purpose and direction than his own daily existence. The beer that had become his evening companion started as a single can to take the edge off the day's accumulated disappointments, but had gradually expanded into a multi-course meal of liquid numbness. It wasn't alcoholism, he told himself, because he never drank in the morning and he could stop anytime he wanted. The fact that he never wanted to stop was a detail he preferred not to examine too closely. Night brought the cruelest hours, when the silence became absolute and his mind was free to replay every decision that had led him to this place. The moment he'd signed the partnership papers with Marcus Whitfield without having them reviewed by his own attorney. The day he'd ignored his grandfather's voice in his head, warning him that something felt wrong about the new contracts. The phone call when he'd learned that the company's environmental violations were being blamed on his oversight rather than Whitfield's deliberate fraud. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and populated by dreams that felt more like punishment than rest. He'd find himself back in the boardroom, watching helplessly as lawyers explained how his signature on documents he'd never seen had made him liable for debts he'd never incurred. Or he'd be walking through the Morrison Timber Company offices, seeing the empty desks where his employees had once worked, their family photographs still sitting beside computers that would never be turned on again. The worst dreams were the ones where his grandfather appeared, not angry or disappointed, but simply sad. The old man would walk through the abandoned workshop, running his gnarled hands over tools that had been in the family for generations, asking questions that Jake could never answer. How had 3 generations of honest work come to this? Where had the pride gone that had once made the Morrison name mean something in these mountains? Jake would wake from these dreams with his heart pounding and his sheets soaked in sweat, the taste of failure bitter in his mouth. The digital clock beside his bed would inevitably show some unholy hour between 3 and 4 in the morning, that dead zone when hope seemed impossible and dawn felt like a theoretical concept rather than a reliable occurrence. But on this particular morning, something was different. The routine unfolded with its usual mechanical precision, but underneath the familiar rhythms, Jake could feel something stirring. It might have been anticipation, though he'd almost forgotten what that emotion felt like. Emma Walsh and her daughter Lily were scheduled to return today for their first official cleaning session, and despite his attempts to maintain his usual pessimistic outlook, Jake found himself looking forward to their arrival with something approaching enthusiasm. The realization that he was anticipating human contact felt both foreign and slightly terrifying. For years he'd cultivated his isolation like a garden, carefully tending to his solitude and protecting it from the intrusions of a world that had proven itself untrustworthy. The idea that 2 strangers could penetrate that carefully constructed defense system with nothing more than professional cleaning services and a child's innocent curiosity seemed impossible. Yet here he was, checking the clock and calculating how many hours remained until they would arrive. He found himself making small improvements to the cabin, not from shame about its condition, but from a slowly awakening desire to be worthy of the effort Emma was planning to invest in his space. The gesture felt revolutionary after years of deliberate neglect, a tiny rebellion against the entropy that had become his closest companion. Part 3: The Return and Deeper Connection. The sound of gravel crunching under tires arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, punctuality that impressed Jake despite his determination to remain cynical about the entire arrangement. Through the living room window, he watched Emma's reliable sedan navigate the winding drive with the same careful precision she'd displayed during their first meeting. Today, however, the car was packed with cleaning supplies, equipment bags, and what appeared to be enough organizational tools to tackle a disaster zone, which was probably an accurate assessment of the task ahead. Emma emerged from the driver's seat wearing practical clothes that somehow managed to look both professional and prepared for serious labor. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and she moved with the efficient energy of someone who approached challenges with systematic determination rather than overwhelming force. Even from a distance, Jake could see that she'd come prepared for battle, her supplies organized with military precision in the back of her vehicle. Lily bounced out of the passenger side with the irrepressible energy of childhood, her small backpack suggesting that she'd come prepared for a long day of whatever adventures might present themselves while her mother worked. She wore bright purple sneakers that seemed to glow against the autumn landscape, and her eyes immediately began scanning Jake's property with the same intense curiosity she'd displayed during their first visit. Jake opened the front door before they could knock, a gesture that felt simultaneously welcoming and defensive. He'd spent the morning engaged in what could generously be called preliminary cleaning, though his efforts had been more about damage control than actual improvement. Still, the cabin looked marginally less like a crime scene than it had the week before. which represented progress of sorts. Emma's smile was warm but professional as she greeted him, her eyes making the same quick assessment of his appearance that he'd come to expect from people who dealt with individuals in crisis. Today, however, her expression seemed to register subtle improvements. Jake had managed to shower and locate clothing that didn't smell like despair, small victories that apparently hadn't gone unnoticed. Behind her, Lily waved with the uninhibited friendliness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be cautious about social interactions. Her presence immediately shifted the cabin's energy, introducing an element of lightness that the space hadn't experienced in years. She looked around with undisguised fascination, as if Jake's neglected home was the most interesting place she'd ever encountered. Emma began unloading her supplies with practiced efficiency, explaining her methodology as she worked. She'd start with what she called the foundation areas, the kitchen and bathroom, spaces where cleanliness directly impacted health and basic functionality. From there, she'd work outward through the living areas, tackling organization and deep cleaning in stages that wouldn't overwhelm either the space or its occupant. The systematic approach appealed to Jake's dormant business instincts, reminding him of project management principles he'd once applied to timber operations. There was something reassuring about watching someone approach a seemingly impossible task with clear planning and realistic expectations. Emma didn't promise miracles or transformations, just steady progress toward livability. Lily had appointed herself as the unofficial tour guide, pointing out details she'd noticed during their previous visit and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated an impressive memory for someone her age. She wanted to know about the age of the cabin's construction, the species of trees visible through the windows, and whether Jake had built any of the furniture himself. Her curiosity was infectious, and Jake found himself answering with more enthusiasm than he'd felt about anything in months. The cleaning process began with Emma donning rubber gloves and approaching the kitchen sink with the determination of someone preparing to perform surgery. The accumulation of neglect that Jake had grown accustomed to looked genuinely shocking when viewed through fresh eyes. And he felt a flush of embarrassment that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with basic human dignity. But Emma worked without judgment, her movements efficient and purposeful as she began the archaeological excavation of dishes and utensils that had achieved states of decay that belonged in science textbooks rather than home kitchens. She didn't comment on the condition of things, didn't offer observations about how situations reached such extremes, just rolled up her sleeves and began the patient work of restoration. Lily had discovered Jake's collection of books, a library that had once been his pride but now sat dusty and forgotten in built-in shelves throughout the cabin. She moved from shelf to shelf with the focused attention of a serious reader, occasionally pulling volumes down to examine their covers or read back cover descriptions. Her commentary revealed a reading level well above her apparent age, along with tastes that ran toward adventure stories and nature guides. Jake found himself drawn into conversation with her about various titles, discussions that revealed how long it had been since he'd thought about books as sources of pleasure rather than painful reminders of intellectual interests he'd abandoned, along with everything else. Lily's enthusiasm was infectious, her questions about plots and characters forcing him to remember why he'd once found reading enjoyable rather than just another form of self-torture. The morning progressed with a rhythm that felt almost musical, the sounds of productive work creating a soundtrack that the cabin hadn't heard in years. Emma's systematic approach to the kitchen gradually revealed surfaces and appliances that Jake had forgotten existed, while her organizational skills transformed chaos into something approaching functionality. She worked with the steady persistence of someone who understood that lasting change happened through accumulated small improvements rather than dramatic gestures. Meanwhile, Lily had appointed herself as Jake's personal entertainment committee, regaling him with stories about school, friends, and a complex social hierarchy among second graders that apparently rivaled international diplomacy in its complexity. Her chatter filled the cabin's silence with life, voices and laughter replacing the oppressive quiet that had become Jake's primary companion. During a break for lunch, Emma revealed more about their situation through casual conversation and careful omissions. They'd moved to Cedar Falls 6 months ago from somewhere she referred to only as back east, a relocation that had been necessary rather than voluntary. She spoke about building a new life with the careful optimism of someone who'd learned not to take stability for granted. While her references to their previous home carried undertones of difficulty that she clearly preferred not to explore in detail. Lily's contributions to these conversations were equally revealing, though in the unconscious way that children exposed family realities without understanding their significance. She mentioned missing friends from their old school, talked about their apartment in town with the enthusiasm of someone grateful for basic shelter, and referenced their father in past tense that suggested permanent absence rather than temporary separation. Jake began to piece together a picture of two people who'd left difficult circumstances behind and were working to build something better with limited resources and abundant determination. Emma's careful budgeting, her strategic approach to building a business, and her obvious devotion to her daughter painted a portrait of someone who understood both struggle and resilience in ways that Jake was only beginning to comprehend. The afternoon brought deeper cleaning and more personal conversation. Emma worked with the focused intensity of someone who took pride in her craft, while Jake found himself volunteering to help in ways that surprised them both. It had been years since he'd engaged in productive labor alongside another person, and the experience of working toward shared goals felt revolutionary after so much solitary existence. They fell into an easy rhythm, Emma directing the technical aspects of the cleaning while Jake handled the physical labor that his larger frame made more efficient. Moving furniture, carrying supplies, reaching high places where years of neglect had accumulated, tasks that felt meaningful because they contributed to something larger than his own survival. Lily had established herself as the project's unofficial supervisor, offering encouragement and commentary that kept spirits high even when the work revealed problems more serious than surface dirt. Her observations about the cabin's potential, delivered with a child's absolute certainty, began to shift Jake's perception of his own space. Through her eyes, he could almost see past the neglect to the home it might become again. As the day wore on, Emma's professional demeanor gradually relaxed into something more natural and friendly. She began sharing stories about other clients, amusing anecdotes about cleaning challenges that made Jake's situation seem less like unique failure and more like one variation on universal human struggles. Her laughter was infectious, filling the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with human connection. The transformation of the kitchen, while far from complete, was dramatic enough to feel miraculous. Surfaces emerged from under layers of accumulated neglect, appliances were restored to functionality, and the space began to resemble a place where people might actually prepare and share meals. Emma's organizational systems were elegant in their simplicity, creating storage solutions that would make maintaining the improvements possible rather than overwhelming. By late afternoon, Jake realized he'd been watching Emma work with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity about cleaning techniques. There was something mesmerizing about her competence, the way she approached problems with calm assessment and practical solutions. She moved through his space with respect for its potential rather than judgment about its current condition, treating his home like something worth saving rather than something to be endured. The realization that he was attracted to her came as a shock that left him temporarily speechless. It had been so long since he'd felt anything resembling romantic interest that the emotion seemed foreign, like a language he'd once spoken but could no longer remember. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, opening possibilities he'd assumed were permanently closed while simultaneously threatening the careful numbness he'd cultivated as protection against further disappointment. Emma seemed oblivious to his internal turmoil, focused on explaining the maintenance routines that would preserve the day's progress. Her instructions were clear and realistic, acknowledging his current limitations while providing frameworks for continued improvement. She spoke about their next session with the assumption that there would be one, planning future progress with an optimism that Jake found both infectious and intimidating. As they prepared to leave, Lily surprised Jake by asking if she could help with his workshop during their next visit. Her request revealed that she'd been thinking about their previous conversation, planning ways to contribute to projects that interested her. The idea of having a child's help with woodworking seemed both delightful and terrifying, opening possibilities for connection that Jake hadn't considered. Emma's response to her daughter's suggestion was immediate approval, though Jake caught the quick calculation in her eyes that suggested careful budgeting of time and energy. She was clearly someone who weighed every decision against multiple priorities, balancing her daughter's interests with business necessities and personal goals in ways that required constant attention and adjustment. The goodbye felt different from their first departure, less formal and more personal. Emma's smile carried warmth that went beyond professional courtesy, while Lily's enthusiasm about returning made it clear that she'd genuinely enjoyed their day together. The cabin felt different after they left, not just cleaner but somehow more alive, as if their presence had reminded the space what it meant to be a home rather than just shelter. That evening, Jake found himself looking around the transformed kitchen with something approaching wonder. The change was dramatic enough to feel almost magical, but more importantly, it suggested that other transformations might be possible. If a space could be reclaimed from neglect and restored to functionality, perhaps the same principle applied to other areas of life that had seemed permanently damaged. For the first time in years, Jake fell asleep without the assistance of alcohol. His dreams filled not with regrets and recriminations but with plans and possibilities that seemed almost within reach. Part 4. Growing Attraction and Shared Vulnerability. The week following Emma's first official cleaning session passed with an anticipation that Jake barely recognized as his own emotion. He found himself maintaining the improvements she'd made to his kitchen with a diligence that surprised him, washing dishes immediately after use and wiping down surfaces with the attention of someone who'd remembered what it felt like to take pride in his environment. The simple act of keeping things clean felt like a form of respect, both for Emma's work and for the possibility that his life might contain more purpose than mere survival. Jake's daily routines began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Morning walks through the forest took on new meaning as he found himself noticing details he'd ignored for years. The way autumn light filtered through changing leaves, the intricate architecture of spider webs heavy with dew, the complex ecosystem that flourished in the mountains around his cabin. Where once these observations would have felt like painful reminders of beauty he could no longer appreciate, now they seemed like preparations for conversations he might have with Lily about the natural world she found so fascinating. The workshop, that monument to abandoned dreams, began to call to him in ways it hadn't for years. Jake found himself standing in the doorway, assessing the space not as a museum of failure but as a venue for potential projects. Lily's expressed interest in woodworking had awakened something in him that felt dangerously close to hope, the possibility that skills he'd assumed were permanently buried might still serve some purpose beyond professional advancement. He spent hours organizing tools and clearing workbenches, ostensibly preparing for Lily's visit, but really engaging in a form of archaeology that excavated layers of his former self. Each tool held memories of projects completed, skills developed, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional from raw materials. The muscle memory remained intact, his hands remembering the proper grip for various implements even as his mind struggled to believe that creativity might still be possible. Emma called midweek to confirm their next appointment, her voice carrying a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy. The conversation lasted longer than necessary, drifting from logistics into more personal territory as she asked about his week and shared small details about hers. Jake found himself reluctant to end the call, savoring the connection to another adult who seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts and experiences. She mentioned that Lily had been talking constantly about their visit, planning projects, and asking questions about mountain wildlife that Emma couldn't answer. The image of the little girl thinking about him between visits created a sensation in Jake's chest that he couldn't quite identify, something warm and protective that reminded him of feelings he'd thought were permanently lost. The idea that he might matter to someone, even a child who barely knew him, felt both wonderful and terrifying. Their second visit began with Lily's excited exploration of the workshop, her enthusiasm infectious as she examined tools and asked detailed questions about their functions.
Jake found himself explaining woodworking techniques with a passion he'd thought was dead, describing the properties of different wood species and the satisfaction of seeing a project progress from concept to completion. Her attention was complete and respectful, the focused listening of someone who understood that she was receiving valuable information. Emma worked in the main cabin with the same systematic approach she'd displayed during their first session, but Jake noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She seemed more relaxed, more willing to engage in casual conversation while she worked. Her comments about his efforts to maintain the kitchen's improved condition carried genuine approval, acknowledgement that he was taking their collaboration seriously. The cleaning progressed into the living room, a space that had been serving primarily as a storage area for things Jake couldn't decide whether to keep or discard. Emma's organizational skills proved invaluable as she helped him sort through accumulated possessions, making decisions about what served a purpose and what had become mere clutter. The process was emotional, each item carrying memories that ranged from painful to bittersweet. She handled his belongings with respect, asking questions about significance rather than making assumptions about value. When they encountered photographs from his previous life, images of Morrison Timber Company events and family gatherings, Emma listened without judgment as Jake explained the context and shared memories that had become too painful to revisit alone. Her presence made the sorting bearable, transforming what might have been another exercise in self-torture into something resembling healing. Lily had appointed herself as the workshop's restoration project manager, creating elaborate plans for organizing tools and preparing workspace for future projects. Her suggestions revealed both practical intelligence and creative thinking, approaches to problems that impressed Jake with their elegance and efficiency. Working alongside her felt natural in ways he hadn't expected, her curiosity providing motivation for explanations that helped him rediscover his own expertise. The day's major breakthrough came when Emma suggested they tackle Jake's bedroom, the space where his depression had been most completely expressed through neglect and self-destructive behavior. The room had become a cave where he retreated from the world, and the idea of exposing it to outside attention felt vulnerably intimate. But Emma's matter-of-fact approach stripped away the shame, treating the space as just another area that needed systematic attention rather than evidence of personal failure. Working together in the confined space created an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with trust. Emma's presence in his most private area felt like acceptance, acknowledgement that she wasn't frightened by his struggles or disgusted by their visible evidence. She worked with the same professional competence she displayed everywhere else, but Jake caught her glancing at him with expressions that suggested growing understanding and concern. The process of cleaning his bedroom forced Jake to confront the depth of his isolation in ways that were both painful and liberating. Emma's questions about his daily routines revealed how completely he'd withdrawn from basic self-care, while her suggestions for improvements acknowledged his challenges without enabling his self-destructive patterns. She spoke about depression with the knowledge of someone who'd encountered it before, either personally or through people she cared about. Lily's contribution to the bedroom project was characteristically direct and insightful. She announced that the room felt lonely and suggested that it needed more windows, or at least curtains that would let in more light. Her observation led to a discussion about the relationship between environment and mood that revealed Emma's background in psychology, knowledge she'd apparently acquired through necessity rather than formal education. As they worked, Emma shared carefully edited details about their previous life, stories that revealed hardship overcome through determination and mutual support. She spoke about Lily's father in past tense that suggested death rather than divorce, describing him as someone who'd struggled with issues that had ultimately proved insurmountable. The parallels to Jake's own situation weren't lost on either of them, creating an understanding that went
Beyond words. The afternoon brought unexpected rain, a mountain shower that drummed against the cabin's roof with rhythmic intensity. The sound created a cocoon of intimacy around their work, making the outside world feel distant and irrelevant. Jake found himself working closer to Emma than necessity required, drawn by her presence in ways that had nothing to do with the cleaning project, and everything to do with human connection he'd forgotten was possible. During a break from the physical labor, they found themselves sitting at his newly functional kitchen table, sharing coffee and watching Lily arrange tools in the workshop with scientific precision. The domestic scene felt simultaneously natural and miraculous, as if Jake had accidentally stumbled into a life that belonged to someone else. Emma's presence across from him made the cabin feel like a home rather than just shelter, while Lily's laughter from the workshop provided a soundtrack of pure joy. The conversation that followed was the most personal they'd shared, moving beyond surface pleasantries into territory that required actual vulnerability. Emma talked about the challenges of starting over, the difficulty of building a business while raising a child alone, the careful balance between hope and realistic expectations that single parenthood required. Her honesty invited reciprocal disclosure, and Jake found himself talking about his depression with a candor that surprised them both. He described the progression from business failure to emotional collapse, the way setbacks had accumulated until forward movement seemed impossible. Emma listened without offering solutions or minimizing his struggles, providing the gift of witnessed pain that began to transform his isolation into shared experience. Her understanding came not from professional training, but from personal knowledge of how circumstances could overwhelm even strong people. The intimacy of their conversation created an atmosphere charged with possibilities that neither acknowledged directly. Jake became increasingly aware of Emma's physical presence, the way she moved through his space with growing familiarity, the unconscious grace of her gestures as she worked. Her competence was attractive in ways that had nothing to do with conventional beauty, and everything to do with the magnetic pull of someone who approached life with purpose and determination. Emma seemed similarly affected by their proximity, her professional boundaries softening into something more personal and immediate. She began touching him casually, a hand on his arm for emphasis during conversation, fingers brushing his as they worked together on projects. The contact was electric in ways that reminded Jake of feelings he'd assumed were permanently dormant, awakening responses that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Lily's presence provided both catalyst and constraint for the growing attraction between the adults. Her innocent observations about their interactions revealed dynamics that they might have missed or denied, while her need for attention ensured that any romantic development would have to include consideration of her feelings and security. The child's obvious fondness for Jake added complexity to the situation, creating stakes that went beyond simple adult attraction. As the day progressed, the transformation of Jake's living space became secondary to the transformation occurring within him. Emma's presence was awakening parts of his personality that had been dormant for years, reminding him that he was capable of caring about something beyond his own survival. The realization was both liberating and frightening, opening possibilities for connection while simultaneously threatening the protective numbness he'd cultivated as defense against further disappointment. The goodbye was again different from their previous departure, more reluctant and emotionally charged. Emma's smile carried warmth that went far beyond professional courtesy, while her comments about their next visit suggested genuine anticipation rather than mere business obligation. Lily's enthusiasm about returning was matched by Jake's own eagerness for their company, emotions that felt both natural and revolutionary after years of dreading human contact. That evening, Jake found himself in his transformed bedroom, lying on fresh sheets and staring at a ceiling that no longer bore water stains. The change was dramatic enough to feel magical, but more importantly, it represented possibilities for other transformations that seemed suddenly within reach. Emma's presence in his life was catalyzing changes that went far beyond household organization, awakening hopes and desires he'd assumed were permanently buried beneath years of depression and isolation. For the first time in years, Jake fell asleep anticipating tomorrow rather than dreading it. His dreams filled with images of auburn hair and purple sneakers, of laughter echoing through his workshop and warm smiles across his kitchen table. The future, which had seemed like an impossibility for so long, was beginning to feel like a destination he might actually want to reach. Part 5. Past revealed through growing trust. The revelation came during their third week together, emerging not through dramatic confession but through the gradual accumulation of trust that had been building between them like sedimentary layers of shared experience. Jake had grown comfortable enough with Emma's presence to let his guard down, allowing glimpses of his former self to surface during their conversations about everything from local weather patterns to Lily's impressive collection of interesting rocks. It began with Emma's casual observation about the quality of craftsmanship in his cabin's construction, particularly the built-in shelving and custom millwork that revealed an eye for detail and proportion that went beyond mere carpentry. Her questions about the builder led Jake to admit that he'd done most of the finish work himself, back when he'd owned Morrison Timber Company and had access to the finest materials and unlimited time to perfect every joint and detail. The mention of his former business opened a door that Jake had kept firmly closed for years, but Emma's genuine interest and lack of judgment made the sharing feel safe rather than exposing. She asked thoughtful questions about the timber industry, revealing a curiosity about forestry management and sustainable harvesting that impressed him with its sophistication. Her interest wasn't merely polite conversation but reflected genuine fascination with topics that had once been his consuming passion. Lily's discovery of his design sketches in the workshop provided another catalyst for disclosure. She'd been exploring the space with her characteristic thoroughness when she uncovered a portfolio of architectural drawings and furniture designs that Jake had created during his most productive and creative period. The sketches revealed an artistic sensibility that went far beyond commercial timber operations, showing detailed plans for custom homes, handcrafted furniture, and decorative elements that transformed functional items into works of art. Emma's response to the sketches was immediate and visceral, her appreciation evident in the way she studied each drawing with the attention usually reserved for museum exhibits. She understood instinctively that she was looking at work that represented more than professional competence, recognizing the creative vision that had driven Jake to excel in ways that went far beyond financial success. Her admiration was genuine and informed, coming from someone who appreciated both technical skill and artistic vision. The conversation that followed revealed the scope of what Jake had lost when Morrison Timber Company collapsed, not just financial security but an entire identity built around creative problem-solving and environmental stewardship. He described projects that had ranged from custom homes designed to work with natural landscapes to furniture pieces that had been featured in regional design magazines. The company had been more than a business. It had been a platform for expressing values about sustainability, craftsmanship, and the relationship between human creativity and natural resources. Emma listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that she was hearing about more than business failure. Recognizing that Jake was describing the dismantling of a life's work that had represented his deepest values and most meaningful relationships. Her questions revealed insight into the psychological impact of such comprehensive loss, understanding that came from her own experience with life-altering setbacks rather than theoretical knowledge. The story of Marcus Whitfield's betrayal emerged gradually, details revealed as Jake found himself able to articulate experiences that had previously been too painful to examine. Emma's presence made the telling bearable, her understanding nods and thoughtful questions providing the support necessary for him to work through the complex emotions surrounding his former partner's systematic destruction of everything Jake had built. He described Whitfield as someone who'd initially seemed to share his values about sustainable forestry and quality craftsmanship, a partnership that had appeared to offer expansion opportunities while maintaining the company's commitment to environmental responsibility. The betrayal had been particularly devastating because it had involved not just financial fraud but the corruption of principles that Jake had considered sacred, turning his own ethical commitments into weapons used against him. The legal battles that followed had been exercises in futility. Attempts to recover stolen assets that had been hidden through layers of corporate complexity that made recovery impossible without resources Jake no longer possessed. Lawyers who'd initially expressed confidence about successful prosecution had gradually become evasive as the scope of Whitfield's planning became apparent, leaving Jake not just financially ruined but legally vulnerable to charges related to environmental violations he'd never committed. Emma's response to these revelations was a mixture of outrage and protectiveness that surprised Jake with its intensity. Her anger on his behalf felt like validation after years of self-doubt and self-blame,
confirmation that his sense of injustice was justified rather than merely the self-pity of someone who'd failed to adapt to changing circumstances. Her understanding of the psychological impact helped him begin to separate legitimate grief from destructive self-recrimination that had been poisoning his thoughts for years. The afternoon when Emma finally shared her own story came during an unexpected thunderstorm that trapped them inside the cabin while Lily napped on the newly organized living room couch. The rain hammered against the windows with mountain intensity, creating a cocoon of intimacy that seemed to invite deeper honesty than their usual careful exchanges. Emma had been organizing Jake's home office, a space that had become a graveyard of business documents and legal papers, when she discovered a framed photograph of him receiving an Environmental Stewardship Award from the State Forestry Department. The picture showed a different man entirely, someone confident and purposeful, wearing a suit that fit properly and smiling with genuine pride at an accomplishment that mattered beyond personal gain. Emma held the photograph for a long moment, studying the face of someone who seemed like a stranger compared to the isolated hermit she'd first met. Her observation that he looked happy in the picture opened a conversation about the person he'd been before circumstances had stripped away every source of meaning and connection in his life. Jake's description of his former self felt like talking about someone else entirely. A successful businessman who'd balanced environmental consciousness with profitable operations, someone who'd employed half the men in Cedar Falls and provided health care for their families. The company had been featured in trade publications as a model for sustainable forestry practices, and Jake had spoken at conferences about balancing commercial success with ecological responsibility. He'd been respected in the industry, sought out for advice, invited to serve on environmental advisory boards. The contrast between that man and his current circumstances was so stark that Emma initially struggled to reconcile them. But her questions revealed growing understanding of how completely external circumstances could dismantle even the strongest foundation. She began sharing her own experiences with life-altering changes, carefully at first, then with increasing openness as Jake's acceptance encouraged deeper revelation. Emma's story emerged in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that gradually revealed a picture of struggle and resilience that matched Jake's own experience with loss. She'd been married to a man named David Walsh, a military veteran who'd returned from overseas deployment, carrying invisible wounds that had gradually consumed their marriage and destroyed his ability to function in civilian life. The David she'd married had been gentle and protective, someone who'd made her feel safe in a world that had often seemed hostile and unpredictable. But the man who'd returned from his second tour had been someone else entirely, haunted by experiences he couldn't share, and pain he couldn't process. Emma described the gradual deterioration of their relationship with the clinical detachment of someone who'd been forced to analyze trauma in order to survive it. David's drinking had started as occasional stress relief but had escalated into constant self-medication that made him unpredictable and sometimes violent. The violence had never been directed at Lily, a boundary that David had maintained even in his darkest moments. But Emma had borne the brunt of his rage and frustration as he'd struggled with demons that professional help couldn't seem to touch. She'd tried everything from counseling to medical intervention, but David's pride had made him resistant to admitting he needed help, while his military training had given him sophisticated skills for hiding the extent of his problems from outside observers. The end had come not through dramatic confrontation but through quiet desperation. Emma's growing realization that staying would eventually destroy all three of them. David's drinking had cost him his job, then his driver's license, then his ability to maintain relationships with anyone beyond his immediate family. Emma had found herself becoming both caretaker and enabler, trying to manage his addiction while protecting Lily from its consequences. The final straw had been David's arrest for driving under the influence with Lily in the car, an incident that had forced Emma to choose between loyalty to her husband and safety for her daughter. The decision had been agonizing but ultimately clear, leading to a separation that had become permanent when David had died in a single car accident 3 months later. The circumstances suggested suicide rather than accident, a conclusion that had left Emma carrying guilt and grief in equal measure. Jake listened to Emma's story with the focused attention of someone who understood how external circumstances could overwhelm even strong people. Recognizing parallels between her experience with David's self-destruction and his own battle with depression and isolation, Her strength in making impossible choices impressed him, while her vulnerability in sharing such painful memories created an intimacy that went far beyond their business relationship. The conversation revealed that Emma's move to Cedar Falls had been motivated by the need to escape memories and judgmental neighbors who'd never understood the complexities of loving someone whose mental illness made them dangerous to themselves and others. She'd chosen the mountains specifically for their isolation and the opportunity to start over where no one knew their history or had preconceived notions about single mothers and family tragedy. Building her cleaning business had been an act of survival as much as entrepreneurship, a way to create income while maintaining the flexibility necessary for single parenthood. Emma's systematic approach to helping others organize their lives reflected her own need for control after years of chaos, while her understanding of people in crisis came from hard-won personal experience rather than professional training. The revelation that they were both refugees from circumstances beyond their control created a bond between them that transcended romantic attraction, though it certainly intensified it. Jake began to understand that Emma's presence in his life wasn't charity or professional obligation, but the natural gravitational pull between two people who'd survived similar devastation and recognized in each other the possibility of healing. Lily's role in their developing relationship became clearer as Emma shared details about her daughter's resilience and adaptability. The little girl had witnessed her father's deterioration and death with the horrifying awareness that children possessed about adult problems, but she'd somehow emerged from the experience with her fundamental optimism intact. Her interest in Jake represented more than childhood curiosity about a new adult in her sphere. It reflected her hunger for stable masculine presence that wasn't associated with violence or unpredictability. Emma's careful observation of Jake's interactions with Lily revealed protective instincts that went beyond normal parental caution. She'd learned to read people for signs of the destructive patterns that had characterized David's illness, watching for indicators that might suggest Jake posed similar risks to her daughter's emotional security. The fact that she was allowing their relationship to deepen suggested that Jake had passed tests he hadn't even known he was taking. The afternoon progressed with a level of emotional intimacy that neither had experienced in years, their shared vulnerabilities creating space for honesty that went far beyond polite social interaction. Jake found himself talking about his depression with a clarity that helped him understand his own experience, while Emma's questions and observations provided perspectives that challenged his assumptions about failure and personal responsibility. The thunderstorm outside provided a natural soundtrack for their emotional revelation, the rhythm of rain and thunder creating a sense of being suspended outside normal time and social constraints. The cabin felt like a sanctuary where truth-telling was not only safe but necessary, where the carefully maintained facades that protected them in the outside world could be temporarily abandoned. Emma's professional work in his home took on new meaning as their personal stories intertwined. Her systematic restoration of his living space becoming a metaphor for the healing that was occurring between them. The organization and cleaning that had initially seemed like practical necessity now felt like collaboration toward shared goals that went far beyond household management. Jake's workshop became a focal point for their growing connection, a space where Emma could see evidence of the creative and productive person he'd been before circumstances had derailed his sense of purpose. Her appreciation for his craftsmanship wasn't merely polite admiration but reflected genuine understanding of the artistic vision that had once driven his professional success. She began making suggestions for projects that might help him reconnect with skills and interests that depression had rendered inaccessible. The discovery of his design portfolio led to conversations about future possibilities that felt revolutionary after years of assuming that forward movement was impossible. Emma's encouragement wasn't the hollow optimism of someone trying to cheer up a depressed person, but the practical assessment of someone who could see potential that circumstances had obscured rather than destroyed. Her questions about his woodworking techniques revealed her own artistic sensibilities, knowledge about design and craftsmanship that came from genuine interest rather than polite curiosity. Emma had studied interior design before marriage and motherhood had redirected her priorities, and her understanding of spatial relationships and aesthetic principles provided new perspectives on his work that challenged him to think beyond purely functional applications. The growing attraction between them became impossible to ignore, as emotional intimacy created space for physical awareness that had been dormant in both their lives for different reasons. Jake began noticing details about Emma's appearance and mannerisms that had nothing to do with professional competence and everything to do with her appeal as a woman. The way she moved through his space with increasing familiarity, the unconscious grace of her gestures as she worked, the warmth of her smile when she looked at him across his restored kitchen table. Emma seemed similarly affected by their proximity, her careful professional boundaries softening into something more personal and immediate. She began incorporating casual physical contact into their interactions, touches that lingered longer than necessary and created electric moments of awareness that charged the atmosphere between them. The attraction was mutual and increasingly difficult to pretend they didn't notice, though both were careful to maintain appropriate behavior while Lily was present. The little girl's innocent observations about their interactions revealed dynamics that they might have missed or denied. Her comments about how much happier her mother seemed lately and how much she enjoyed spending time at Jake's cabin. Lily's obvious fondness for Jake added both urgency and complexity to the situation, creating stakes that went beyond simple adult attraction to include considerations of family stability and childhood security. As evening approached and the storm began to clear, the three of them found themselves reluctant to end the day despite the completion of their planned work. The cabin felt different, not just because of the physical improvements but because of the emotional transformation that had occurred within its walls. Jake's space had become a place where healing was possible, where connections could form between people who'd learned to protect themselves through isolation. Emma's departure that evening felt different from their previous goodbyes, more emotionally charged and reluctant. The day's revelations had created an intimacy that made separation feel artificial, as if they were interrupting a conversation that needed to continue. Jake found himself standing in his doorway long after their taillights had disappeared, aware that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what might be possible between them. The week that followed was filled with anticipation that had nothing to do with cleaning services and everything to do with the hope that real connection might be possible after years of believing that such things belonged to other people's lives. Jake found himself preparing for Emma's return with attention to details that went far beyond household maintenance, choosing clothes with care and actually looking in mirrors to assess his appearance for the first time in years. His daily routines began incorporating elements that reflected consideration for others, small changes that indicated his growing investment in presenting himself as someone worthy of the trust and affection that Emma and Lily were offering. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. External changes that reflected internal shifts toward hope and possibility that felt both thrilling and terrifying after so many years of protective numbness. The realization that he was falling in love felt like waking up from a coma. Sensations and emotions flooding back with intensity that was overwhelming after years of carefully maintained emotional distance. Emma represented not just romantic possibility, but the chance to rediscover parts of himself that circumstances had buried so deeply that he'd assumed they were permanently lost. The future, which had seemed like an impossibility for so long, was beginning to feel like a destination he might actually want to reach. Part 4: The Final Transformation. The morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for November-autumn sunlight streaming through Jake's newly cleaned windows with a brilliance that seemed to illuminate possibilities rather than merely brightening rooms. He woke without the assistance of an alarm clock for the first time in years, his body's natural rhythms apparently restored by weeks of purposeful activity and human connection that had replaced the formless drift of depression with something approaching genuine anticipation. Emma and Lily were scheduled to arrive for what they'd planned as their final official cleaning session, though the distinction between professional service and personal relationship had long since blurred beyond recognition. Jake found himself preparing for their visit with an attention to detail that had nothing to do with household maintenance and everything to do with the hope that today might mark a beginning, rather than an ending to whatever was developing between them. The cabin around him bore evidence of their collaborative efforts over the past month. Transformation so complete that visitors would struggle to believe the space had recently been a monument to neglect and despair. But more significant than the physical improvements was the emotional restoration that had occurred within Jake himself. the gradual awakening of interests and capabilities that circumstances had buried beneath years of protective numbness. His morning routine now included elements that reflected consideration for others, from coffee preparation that anticipated guests to workshop organization that accommodated a child's enthusiasm for learning new skills. The simple act of caring about his appearance and environment felt revolutionary after years of deliberate neglect. External changes that reflected internal shifts toward hope and possibility that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The sound of gravel under tires announced their arrival precisely at 9 o'clock. Emma's characteristic punctuality having become one of many details about her that Jake had grown to appreciate and anticipate. Through the living room window, he watched Lily bounce from the passenger seat with her usual irrepressible energy. Her bright jacket vivid against the autumn landscape as she immediately began scanning his property for changes or interesting discoveries. Emma emerged from the driver's seat with the purposeful grace that had characterized all her movements since their first meeting. But today Jake detected subtle differences in her demeanor that suggested their relationship had evolved beyond business transactions. Her smile carried warmth that had nothing to do with professional courtesy, while her gaze lingered on his face with an attention that spoke of genuine affection rather than polite interest. The greeting process had evolved over their weeks together from formal courtesy to something approaching family intimacy. Lily's enthusiastic hugs and Emma's increasingly personal conversation creating an atmosphere of welcomed routine rather than scheduled appointment. Jake found himself reluctant to discuss the official agenda for their final session, preferring to focus on the workshop projects that would provide excuses for continued
Collaboration. Their morning began with Lily's immediate migration to the workshop, her growing expertise with basic tools evident in the confident way she handled measuring devices and marking instruments. The birdhouse project they'd been developing over several visits was nearing completion, her careful attention to Jake's instructions producing results that impressed them both with their quality and precision. Working alongside her had reawakened his teaching instincts. The satisfaction of sharing knowledge with someone who approached learning with such genuine enthusiasm. Emma's work in the main cabin had progressed to final touches that would complete their systematic restoration of his living space. But her attention seemed divided between cleaning tasks and observation of the interactions developing between Jake and her daughter. The protective awareness that characterized her monitoring of Lily's relationships had evolved into something approaching approval, her growing trust in Jake's influence evident in her willingness to grant them increasing independence during their workshop sessions. The conversation that developed between the adults while Lily worked on her project revealed how much their understanding of each other had deepened through weeks of shared activity and gradually disclosed personal histories. Emma's questions about his future plans carried implications that went beyond casual curiosity, while Jake's responses reflected growing confidence in possibilities that had recently seemed impossible to contemplate. The breakthrough moment arrived when Emma discovered the business plan that Jake had been secretly developing during evening hours when sleep eluded him. Pages of careful calculations and market research that outlined possibilities for rebuilding his professional life around custom woodworking and architectural consultation. The document represented more than mere wishful thinking, revealing serious consideration of practical steps toward financial independence and creative fulfillment that built on skills and interests that circumstances had temporarily obscured. Emma's response to his business plan was immediate and enthusiastic, her questions revealing knowledge about small business development that surprised Jake with its sophistication and practical understanding. The revelation that she'd been researching market opportunities for artisan furniture and custom millwork suggested that she'd been thinking about his future with an investment that went far beyond professional service or casual friendship. Their discussion of his business possibilities led naturally to considerations of how such developments might affect their relationship, conversations that required careful navigation between hope and realistic expectations. Emma's willingness to discuss long-term scenarios revealed her own growing attachment, while her practical questions about timelines and financial requirements demonstrated that she was thinking seriously about how their lives might intersect beyond their current arrangement. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors in the form of Margaret Thompson from the diner in Cedar Falls, accompanied by Tom Bradley from the hardware store. both of whom had apparently heard about Jake's recent improvements and wanted to discuss potential business opportunities. Their arrival felt like validation from the community that had watched his descent into isolation with sympathy but had been unable to offer assistance until he demonstrated readiness to engage with life again. Maggie's proposal for custom furniture pieces to upgrade the diner's seating area represented Jake's first potential commission in years. A practical opportunity that would provide both income and proof that his skills retained commercial value. Tom's interest in architectural consultation for expanding his store's retail space offered another avenue toward professional re-establishment, connections that felt like lifelines thrown to someone who'd been drowning in irrelevance. Emma's presence during these business discussions proved invaluable. Her questions and observations revealing aspects of the opportunities that Jake's excitement might have overlooked. Her practical understanding of contract negotiations and project management suggested capabilities that could complement his technical skills, while her enthusiasm for his success created emotional support that made the prospect of returning to professional life feel achievable rather than overwhelming. Lily's contribution to the business conversations came through her innocent questions about whether Jake's new work would interfere with their workshop sessions, concerns that revealed how much their relationship had come to mean to her. The adults' assurances that business success would enhance rather than eliminate their collaborative opportunities seemed to satisfy her, though her protective interest in maintaining their connection was unmistakably clear. The departure of their visitors left Jake energized by possibilities that had seemed impossible only hours earlier. Professional opportunities that could provide the foundation for rebuilding his life around activities that held meaning beyond mere survival. Emma's obvious pride in his achievements felt like validation that went beyond romantic interest. Confirmation that she saw him as someone capable of growth and contribution rather than merely an object of sympathy or charity. The evening meal they shared felt like a celebration of transformations both accomplished and anticipated. Simple food elevated by the significance of what they were acknowledging together. Jake's restored kitchen provided the perfect setting for domestic intimacy that none of them had experienced in their respective recent histories, warm light and comfortable conversation creating an atmosphere that encouraged discussion of futures that might include each other. The conversation that followed dinner ventured into territory that required unprecedented honesty about feelings and intentions that both adults had been carefully avoiding despite their obvious development. Emma's admission that she'd been dreading the end of their professional arrangement because it would eliminate her excuse for regular visits created an opening for Jake to express his own reluctance to return to solitude after experiencing the vitality that her presence brought to his life. The acknowledgement of mutual attraction led to careful exploration of how their relationship might evolve beyond business transactions into something more personal and committed. Both brought caution earned through previous experiences with loss and disappointment, but their growing trust created space for considering possibilities that had seemed too risky to contemplate when they'd first met. Lily's role in any future relationship was addressed with the seriousness that her needs and feelings deserved, both adults recognizing that romantic involvement would necessarily include considerations of family dynamics and childhood security. Her obvious fondness for Jake provided encouragement, while her need for stability created responsibilities that both were prepared to accept as part of any commitment they might make to each other. The practical aspects of their potential future together required discussion of everything from living arrangements to business collaboration, conversations that revealed how naturally their skills and interests might complement each other. Emma's organizational abilities and business experience could enhance Jake's technical expertise, while his workshop could provide the creative outlet she'd abandoned when circumstances had forced her to prioritize survival over personal fulfillment. The goodbye process that evening felt different from their previous farewells, charged with awareness that they were acknowledging a transition from uncertainty to commitment that would reshape all their futures. Emma's embrace lingered with the promise of permanence rather than the reluctance of temporary separation, while Lily's excitement about future workshop projects assumed a continuity that previous visits had only tentatively suggested. Standing in his doorway after their departure, Jake experienced the familiar emptiness that followed their visits, but tonight it carried the weight of anticipation rather than mere loneliness. The cabin around him bore evidence of their collaborative transformation, but more significantly, it had become a space where healing was possible and connection could flourish between people who'd survived similar devastation. The week that followed was filled with activity that felt purposeful rather than merely busy. Jake's engagement with Maggie's furniture commission providing practical focus for energies that had been dormant for years. The satisfaction of working with quality materials toward specific goals reminded him why he'd originally fallen in love with woodworking. While the knowledge that Emma would be sharing in his success created motivation that went beyond professional pride. Emma's daily phone calls to check on his progress evolved into conversations that assumed a future together, practical discussions about logistics and emotional exchanges that deepened their connection despite physical separation. Her investment in his success felt like partnership rather than mere support, while her own planning for business expansion suggested that she was considering their relationship as a foundation for broader life changes. The completion of Lily's birdhouse project provided the occasion for their next meeting, a celebration that acknowledged both the child's accomplishment and the adult relationship that had developed through their shared activities. The little girl's pride in her craftsmanship was matched by her excitement about future projects that would challenge her developing skills, while her casual assumption that Jake would be a permanent fixture in their lives provided the catalyst for final decisions about their relationship's direction. Emma's arrival for the birdhouse presentation brought news that would reshape all their plans. Her announcement that she'd been offered a cleaning contract for a new resort development that would provide financial security beyond anything she'd previously imagined. The opportunity would require expansion of her business and possibly relocation to accommodate the increased workload, decisions that would necessarily include consideration of how Jake and Lily might fit into her changed circumstances. The business opportunity created both excitement and anxiety, representing the kind of professional breakthrough that could eliminate financial pressures while potentially complicating their relationship's development. Emma's questions about Jake's willingness to relocate or adapt his own business plans revealed that she was thinking of their future as necessarily intertwined, while her concern about his response suggested that his preferences would influence her decisions about accepting the contract. Jake's immediate enthusiasm for Emma's success and his willingness to adapt his own plans to support her opportunity provided the reassurance she needed to accept the resort contract, while his suggestions for how their businesses might complement each other revealed thinking that assumed permanent collaboration. The practical discussions that followed confirmed their commitment to building a future together while respecting each other's professional ambitions and personal needs. The afternoon spent planning their combined business venture felt like architectural design for their life together. Systematic consideration of how their individual skills and interests might create something stronger and more sustainable than either could achieve alone. Emma's organizational expertise and customer service experience would enhance Jake's technical capabilities, while his workshop could provide the creative flexibility that would allow both of them to pursue projects that held personal meaning beyond financial necessity. Lily's contributions to their planning process revealed her own anticipation of the family unit they were creating, her suggestions for workshop organization and project priorities demonstrating that she considered herself an integral part of their collaboration. Her excitement about their future home and the expanded possibilities for learning and creativity created emotional momentum that carried the adults past their remaining hesitations about commitment. The evening when they finally acknowledged their love for each other felt like the culmination of weeks of careful approach toward a destination they'd all been hoping to reach. The admission came naturally through conversation about their shared future, emotional honesty that felt both inevitable and miraculous after their respective experiences with loss and disappointment. Emma's acceptance of Jake's proposal that they make their commitment official through marriage surprised them both with its naturalness, the decision feeling like recognition of what had already developed rather than a dramatic change in their relationship's direction. Lily's ecstatic response to the news confirmed that their family unit had been forming regardless of official acknowledgement, her happiness providing validation that their love was creating security rather than disruption in her young life. The months that followed were filled with activity that transformed all their lives in ways that honored both their individual histories and their shared future. Jake's woodworking business thrived through contracts that Emma's resort connection provided, while her cleaning service expanded into comprehensive property management that utilized both their skills. Lily's education benefited from the stability and expanded opportunities that their combined resources provided, her intellectual curiosity flourishing in an environment where learning was valued and supported. Their wedding took place in the workshop where their relationship had deepened through shared projects and mutual support. A ceremony that celebrated not just romantic love but the family they'd created through commitment to each other's healing and growth.
The simple vows they exchanged acknowledged their individual journeys through loss and isolation while promising continued collaboration toward futures that honored both their dreams and their responsibilities to each other. The life they built together in the restored cabin became a testament to the possibility of healing and renewal even after devastating loss. Their success providing inspiration for others in their community who struggled with their own challenges. Jake's transformation from isolated hermit to engaged community member demonstrated that circumstances could be overcome through determination and support. While Emma's achievement of financial independence and personal fulfillment showed that single mothers could create stability while pursuing their own ambitions. Years later, when Lily had grown into a confident young woman whose woodworking skills rivaled her stepfather's, they would look back on that first stormy night when desperation had brought them together as the beginning of something none of them could have imagined. The cabin that had once been Jake's prison had become their sanctuary, while the workshop where he'd mourned his lost dreams had become the foundation for achievements that exceeded anything he'd previously accomplished. Their love story became local legend in Cedar Falls, proof that second chances were possible for people brave enough to risk vulnerability after experiencing devastation. The cleaning service that had brought them together evolved into a model for how business relationships could honor both professional competence and human connection. While their workshop became a gathering place for community members who needed to believe that renewal was possible regardless of how completely circumstances had seemed to destroy their hopes. Jake Morrison, who had once believed that his life's best chapters were permanently closed, discovered that true success was measured not by individual achievement but by the ability to create love and security for the people who mattered most. Emma Walsh, who had fled violence and uncertainty with nothing but determination and her daughter's trust, found that courage could indeed lead to the kind of happiness that made previous struggles feel like preparation rather than punishment. Together they proved that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds, that love could flourish between people who'd learned to protect themselves through isolation, and that families could be created through choice and commitment rather than just circumstance and obligation. Their story became a testament to the possibility of transformation, hope that resonated throughout their mountain community and beyond, inspiring others to believe that their own seemingly impossible dreams might also be within reach. The autumn leaves had returned to Whispering Pine Ridge for the fifth time since Emma Walsh first knocked on Jake Morrison's door, but this October morning carried none of the desperate urgency that had marked their initial meeting. Instead, the mountain air hummed with the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt from ruins, love triumphant over circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. Jake stood on the expanded porch of their renovated cabin, watching his stepdaughter Lily demonstrate advanced woodworking techniques to a group of local teenagers who'd gathered for their weekend workshop series. At 13, she possessed skills that rivaled many adult craftsmen, her natural talent refined through years of patient instruction and countless hours spent alongside Jake in the workshop that had become the heart of their family business. The girl who had once asked tentatively if she could help with his projects now commanded respect from students twice her age, her teaching style blending technical precision with the encouraging patience she'd learned from watching Jake work with struggling apprentices. Her confidence was infectious, inspiring others to attempt projects they'd previously considered beyond their capabilities. Emma emerged from the cabin carrying a tray of hot cider for the workshop participants, her auburn hair now streaked with silver that caught the morning light like precious metal. The years had added lines around her eyes, but they were the kind that came from laughter and contentment rather than worry and struggle. Her cleaning business had evolved into a comprehensive property management company that employed half the women in Cedar Falls, while her marriage to Jake had provided the stability that allowed her natural leadership abilities to flourish. The success of Morrison Walsh Woodworking exceeded anything Jake had achieved with his original timber company, their custom furniture and architectural millwork sought after by clients throughout the Southeast. But more important than financial prosperity was the sense of purpose that permeated every aspect of their daily lives. Work that honored both their individual talents and their commitment to creating beauty that would outlast their own lifetimes. Their workshop had become a pilgrimage destination for aspiring woodworkers who came not just to learn techniques, but to witness proof that devastation could be transformed into triumph through determination and mutual support. Jake's teaching methods emphasized both craftsmanship and character, his instruction encompassing life lessons that went far beyond proper tool usage and joint construction. Emma's role in their business extended beyond administration to include design consultation and client relations, her artistic sensibility complementing Jake's technical expertise in ways that produced results neither could have achieved alone. Their collaboration had created a reputation for excellence that brought commissions from museums and historic preservation societies, projects that challenged their skills while honoring the traditions that had shaped their mountain community. The afternoon brought their weekly visit to Maggie Thompson's diner, where Jake's custom tables and benches had transformed the space into Cedar Falls' unofficial community center. The elderly proprietor had become their unofficial grandmother, her pride in their success evident in the way she displayed photographs of their work alongside testimonials from satisfied customers who'd traveled hundreds of miles to commission pieces from Morrison Walsh Woodworking. Lily's animated conversation with other teenagers revealed her plans for attending art school with a focus on furniture design, ambitions that would honor her mountain heritage while opening doors to opportunities that previous generations of their family had never imagined possible. Her confidence about the future reflected the security that Jake and Emma's love had created, providing the foundation that allowed her to pursue dreams without fear of abandonment or disappointment. The evening meal at their expanded dining table accommodated not just their immediate family but also Tom Bradley and his wife, along with Sheriff David Rivers and his teenage son who was learning woodworking as therapy for injuries sustained in a hunting accident. The gathering represented the extended community that had formed around their workshop, relationships built through shared projects and mutual respect that transcended traditional social boundaries. Jake's transformation from isolated hermit to beloved mentor had occurred gradually, his reputation for patience and wisdom drawing people who needed guidance through their own difficult transitions. His approach to helping others reflected lessons learned through his own journey from despair to fulfillment, understanding earned through experience rather than academic training. Emma's evolution from desperate single mother to successful businesswoman and community leader demonstrated that circumstances could be overcome through determination and strategic thinking, her example inspiring other women who faced similar challenges. Her speaking engagements at regional business conferences focused on building enterprises that honored both financial necessity and personal values, principles she'd learned through trial and error during their early years together. Their love story had become local legend, proof that second chances were possible for people brave enough to risk vulnerability after experiencing devastation. Young couples sought their advice about building relationships that could withstand external pressures, while older residents pointed to their success as evidence that renewal was possible regardless of age or previous failures. The workshop sessions they conducted for troubled teenagers had become a model program that other communities were attempting to replicate, combining technical education with mentorship that addressed underlying issues that traditional approaches had failed to reach. Jake's ability to connect with young people who'd been written off by other adults stemmed from his own experience with feeling worthless and abandoned, while Emma's organizational skills ensured that their programs produced measurable results that impressed even skeptical social service administrators. As night fell over Whispering Pine Ridge, Jake and Emma sat on their porch swing listening to Lily practice violin in the living room, her music adding another layer to the symphony of contentment that characterized their evening routines. The melody drifted through the mountain air, joining the chorus of night sounds that had once emphasized Jake's isolation but now provided peaceful accompaniment to conversations about plans and dreams that seemed entirely achievable. Their marriage had proven that love could indeed conquer circumstances that appeared insurmountable, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. The cabin that had once been Jake's prison had become their sanctuary, while the workshop where he'd mourned lost dreams had become the foundation for achievements that exceeded anything he'd previously imagined. Emma's declaration that she'd hired him to clean his house but he'd ruled her heart had become the family motto, words that captured the transformation that had begun with practical necessity but had bloomed into something infinitely more precious. Their story proved that love could flourish between people who'd learned to protect themselves through isolation, and that families could be created through choice and commitment rather than just circumstance and obligation. The future stretched before them, filled with possibilities that honored both their individual journeys and their shared commitment to creating something beautiful from the raw materials of their combined experiences. Jake Morrison, who had once believed his life's best chapters were permanently closed, had discovered that true success was measured not by individual achievement but by the ability to create love and security for the people who mattered most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.